In March of 1903, construction workers breaking ground for a new railway line outside Willowbrook, Pennsylvania made a discovery that would haunt the small farming community for generations. Buried in what locals had long considered consecrated ground behind the abandoned Willowbrook medical practice, they unearthed the skeletal remains of over 300 men, women, and children. The bones bore no markers, no headstones, no indication of proper Christian burial. What the workers had stumbled upon was a mass grave that represented 16 years of systematic murder disguised as medical care. The Pennsylvania State Police sealed the investigation within hours, and official records from the case remained classified until 1978. Between 1887 and 1903, over 313 people had entered the doors of the Willowbrook family medical practice. None of them had left alive. What Dr. Ezekiel Willowbrook and his family had accomplished in their quiet corner of rural Pennsylvania would later be described by federal investigators as the most extensive case of medical murder in American history. Before we descend into this dark chapter of Pennsylvania history, this story isn't for everyone. Only for those brave enough to confront the most sinister medical practice ever documented in America. If you're ready to join our community of true mystery seekers who aren't afraid to explore the darkest corners of our past, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We have viewers from around the world uncovering these buried truths together. Dr. Ezekiel Willowbrook arrived in Willowbrook during the autumn of 1887, a tall, distinguished man with prematurely grey hair and the kind of gentle bedside manner that immediately earned him the trust of the local farming families. He came with impeccable credentials from the Philadelphia College of Medicine, carrying letters of recommendation from respected physicians in the city, and most importantly, he came with his family. His wife Constance was a trained nurse who had worked in the charity wards of Philadelphia General Hospital. Their 3 children, Marcus aged 16, Elizabeth aged 14, and Samuel aged 12, were well-mannered and immediately enrolled in the local schoolhouse. The family purchased the old Morrison property on the outskirts of town, a substantial 2-story house with enough land to accommodate both their residents and a proper medical practice. Dr. Willowbrook invested heavily in modern medical equipment, importing surgical instruments from Germany and establishing what appeared to be the most advanced medical facility within 50 miles of Willowbrook. Local residents had previously been forced to travel to Pittsburgh for serious medical care, often a journey that proved fatal for critically ill patients. Within months of his arrival, Dr. Willowbrook had established himself as an indispensable member of the community. He treated everything from childhood illnesses to difficult births, never turning away a patient regardless of their ability to pay. He donated his services to the local orphanage and frequently waived fees for struggling farm families. The townspeople considered themselves fortunate to have attracted such a dedicated physician to their remote corner of Pennsylvania. Constance Willowbrook proved equally valuable to the community. She organized the local women's auxiliary, established a lending library in the church basement, and taught basic nursing skills to young women in the area. Her children excelled in their studies and participated actively in church activities. Marcus showed particular aptitude for the sciences and often assisted his father in the medical practice. Elizabeth displayed remarkable organizational skills and helped her mother manage the complex scheduling required for a busy medical practice. Young Samuel, though quiet and studious, showed an unusual interest in chemistry and often could be found reading advanced texts far beyond his grade level. The practice grew rapidly during its first year of operation. Dr. Willowbrook's success in treating several complicated cases that other physicians had given up on earned him a reputation that extended far beyond Willowbrook. Patients began traveling from neighboring counties to seek his expertise. The family expanded the medical facility twice during 1888 to accommodate the growing demand for Dr. Willowbrook's services. However, certain patterns began to emerge that, in retrospect, should have raised concerns among the local population. Dr. Willowbrook seemed to attract an unusually high number of patients who had no local family connections. Traveling salesmen, recent immigrants, and individuals passing through the area on their way to jobs in Pittsburgh or Cleveland frequently sought treatment at his practice. These patients often arrived seeking help for relatively minor ailments but somehow never seemed to continue on their journeys. When concerned residents inquired about these missing travelers, Dr. Willowbrook would explain with apparent sadness that the patient had succumbed to complications from their illness despite his best efforts. He would produce death certificates, properly signed and witnessed, documenting various causes of death from heart failure to consumption. The bodies, he explained, had been given proper Christian burial in the small cemetery behind his practice when no family members could be located to claim them. Local undertaker Henry Morrison, who had sold the property to the Willowbrooks, initially questioned the high mortality rate among Dr. Willowbrook's patients. However, his concerns were quickly dismissed when Dr. Willowbrook provided detailed medical explanations for each death, complete with witness statements from his family members who had assisted in the medical care. Morrison's wife had been successfully treated by Dr. Willowbrook for a chronic condition that had plagued her for years, making it difficult for the undertaker to maintain his suspicions in the face of such obvious medical competence. The winter of 1888 brought an unusually severe outbreak of influenza to the Millbrook area. Dr. Willowbrook worked tirelessly to treat affected families, often traveling through dangerous weather conditions to reach remote farmhouses. His dedication during this crisis further cemented his reputation as a selfless healer. However, the mortality rate during this epidemic was significantly higher than in surrounding communities, a fact that Dr. Willowbrook attributed to the delayed availability of medical care in such a remote area. By the spring of 1889, the Willowbrook family had become so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of Millbrook society that questioning their methods or motives seemed almost treasonous to longtime residents. Dr. Willowbrook served on the town council, Constance led the church ladies' auxiliary, and their children were among the most promising students in the local school. When the occasional traveling stranger disappeared after seeking medical treatment, the community had grown accustomed to Dr. Willowbrook's explanations and no longer questioned the steady stream of burials in the small cemetery behind his practice. The true horror of what the Willowbrook family had accomplished would not be fully understood until investigators began piecing together their background in the months following the 1903 discovery. Dr. Ezekiel Willowbrook had indeed attended the Philadelphia College of Medicine, but his academic record told a disturbing story of a brilliant student who had become increasingly obsessed with the intersection of medicine and mortality. His final thesis, buried in the college archives, explored methods of inducing cardiac arrest that would be undetectable during routine postmortem examinations. Constance Willowbrook's nursing background proved equally troubling upon closer examination. She had been dismissed from Philadelphia General Hospital in 1886 following the suspicious deaths of 3 wealthy patients under her care. Hospital administrators had been unable to prove wrongdoing, but the pattern of deaths among patients who had recently updated their wills naming the hospital as beneficiary had raised enough concerns to warrant her termination. The couple had married hastily in early 1887, just months before their departure for Millbrook. The children, investigators would later discover, had been systematically trained in what the family euphemistically referred to as the family business. Marcus had been taught advanced embalming techniques that went far beyond what any 60-year-old should know. Elizabeth maintained detailed records of patient visits, insurance policies, and property holdings with the precision of a professional accountant. Samuel's interest in chemistry had been carefully nurtured toward the study of untraceable poisons and their effects on human physiology. During their second year in Millbrook, the family's operation became increasingly sophisticated. They developed a careful screening process for potential victims, focusing on individuals who possessed valuable assets but lacked strong family connections. Traveling businessmen carrying large sums of money, recent widows with substantial insurance policies, and immigrants with hidden savings became their preferred targets. The family would spend weeks gaining the trust of selected victims before striking. Dr. Willowbrook's method was elegant in its simplicity. He would diagnose patients with serious but treatable conditions, requiring extended stays at his facility for observation and treatment. During these stays, patients were encouraged to update their wills and insurance policies, with Dr. Willowbrook often recommending local attorneys who were unknowingly complicit in the scheme. The family would study each patient's financial situation meticulously, ensuring maximum profit from each murder. The killing methods varied depending on the victim and circumstances, but Dr. Willowbrook favored techniques that mimicked natural death. He had perfected the administration of digitalis in doses that would cause fatal heart arrhythmias hours after injection, giving him time to establish alibis. Constance specialized in slower poisoning methods using compounds that produce symptoms resembling consumption or other wasting diseases. The children served as witnesses to apparent natural deaths, their testimony lending credibility to falsified death certificates. If you're finding this story as chilling as we are, you're not alone in uncovering these dark secrets that authorities tried to bury for decades. Our community of truth seekers spans the globe, and we want to hear from you. Share this video with a friend who loves dark historical mysteries, and don't forget to hit that like button to support our efforts to bring these forgotten stories to light. The courage to face these truths is what sets our community apart. The disposal of bodies required careful planning and execution. The family had constructed what appeared to be a legitimate cemetery behind their property, complete with wooden crosses and properly maintained grounds. However, the graves contained no coffins, just hastily buried remains stacked in mass burial pits. Samuel had become expert at calculating the precise depth and spacing required to maximize the use of available space while maintaining the appearance of individual graves. Property acquisition became a crucial component of their operation. Victims were encouraged to sell their assets and consolidate their wealth before their supposed medical treatments. The family had established relationships with corrupt land agents and attorneys who facilitated these transactions, taking substantial commissions while ensuring the property ultimately ended up in Willowbrook control. By 1890, the family had quietly acquired over 2,000 acres of prime farmland throughout the county. Insurance fraud provided another lucrative revenue stream. Dr. Willowbrook would recommend that patients increase their life insurance coverage before beginning treatment for their diagnosed conditions, claiming that insurance companies were more generous with seriously ill patients who showed responsibility for their family's welfare. The family had cultivated relationships with several insurance agents who processed these applications without the thorough investigations that would become standard in later years. The local community remained largely oblivious to these activities, seeing only a dedicated physician who worked tirelessly to care for the sick and dying. Dr. Willowbrook's reputation continued to grow throughout Pennsylvania, and he frequently received referrals from physicians in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia who were impressed by his success rates with difficult cases. The irony was that his success lay not in curing patients, but in efficiently killing them while maintaining the appearance of natural death. By 1890, the Willowbrook family had refined their murderous enterprise into a precise machine of death that operated with terrifying efficiency. Their first confirmed victim, according to later investigations, had been a traveling patent medicine salesman named Theodore Hartwell who had sought treatment for a persistent cough in November of 1887. Hartwell had been carrying over $800 in cash and possessed a valuable collection of gold dental work that Dr. Willowbrook had noted during his initial examination. The family's approach to Hartwell established the template they would follow for hundreds of subsequent murders. Dr. Willowbrook diagnosed him with an advanced case of consumption that required immediate and intensive treatment. Hartwell was convinced to take up residence in the small patient quarters attached to the medical practice, where he could receive around-the-clock care. Within days, Constance had befriended the lonely salesman, listening to his stories of life on the road and gradually learning about his financial situation and family connections. Hartwell had mentioned that he was estranged from his only brother in Ohio and had no wife or children. This information sealed his fate in the Willowbrook system. Over the following weeks, his condition appeared to deteriorate despite Dr. Willowbrook's supposedly expert care. The family created detailed medical records documenting his decline, complete with witness statements from all family members regarding his symptoms and their heroic efforts to save him. On December 15, 1887, Theodore Hartwell died of what Dr. Willowbrook certified as acute respiratory failure secondary to advanced pulmonary consumption. The death certificate was properly witnessed and filed with county authorities. His personal effects, including the substantial cash he had been carrying, mysteriously disappeared. Dr. Willowbrook explained to the few townspeople who inquired that Hartwell had requested his belongings be donated to charity, a final act of generosity from a dying man. The success of the Hartwell murder emboldened the family to expand their operations. They developed a systematic approach to victim selection that minimized risk while maximizing profit. Potential targets were carefully observed and evaluated based on several criteria: wealth, lack of local connections, poor health that could justify extended medical treatment, and personality traits that suggested they would be trusting and compliant patients. Marcus Willowbrook, now 18 and officially apprenticed to his father, had become skilled at identifying promising victims among the steady stream of travelers who passed through Millbrook. He would engage them in casual conversation at the general store or tavern, learning about their circumstances and destinations. Information about particularly wealthy or vulnerable individuals was reported back to the family for evaluation and potential targeting. Elizabeth had developed an elaborate filing system that tracked potential victims, their assets, family connections, and optimal approaches for exploitation. Her organizational skills had proven invaluable in managing the complex logistics of the family's operation. She maintained separate records for active cases, completed murders, and long-term targets who required extended grooming before they could be safely eliminated. Samuel, though only 15, had become the family's expert in post-mortem procedures. His chemistry studies had advanced to the point where he could identify optimal methods for accelerating decomposition and eliminating evidence of foul play. He had also taken over the management of the cemetery, ensuring that bodies were disposed of efficiently and that the burial ground maintained its appearance as a proper Christian cemetery. The family's confidence grew with each successful murder. They began targeting increasingly wealthy victims and developing more sophisticated methods of extracting maximum value from each killing. Dr. Willowbrook would spend weeks building trust with selected patients, often treating them for minor ailments to establish his credibility before diagnosing them with more serious conditions that required expensive and extended treatment. The case of Margaret Donovan in spring of 1891 illustrated how ruthlessly efficient the family had become. Donovan, a widow from Chicago traveling to visit relatives in Virginia, had stopped in Millbrook after developing severe stomach pains during her journey. She carried over $1,200 in cash and wore jewelry that Dr. Willowbrook estimated to be worth several $1,000s more. Dr. Willowbrook diagnosed her with a serious abdominal condition that required immediate surgery followed by weeks of recovery. During her stay, Constance learned that Donovan owned valuable property in Chicago and had recently received a substantial inheritance from her deceased husband's estate. The family spent 3 weeks gaining her complete trust before administering a carefully calculated dose of arsenic that would produce symptoms consistent with post-surgical complications. Margaret Donovan died on April 23, 1891, officially of sepsis following abdominal surgery. Her personal effects were valued at over $4,000, representing the family's most profitable single murder to date. Her property in Chicago was quietly sold through intermediaries, with the proceeds flowing back to the Willowbrook family through a network of corrupt attorneys and land agents they had cultivated over the previous 3 years. The success of cases like Donovan's convinced the family that they had perfected their system. They were killing an average of 2 victims per month by 1891, generating income that far exceeded what any legitimate medical practice could produce. Their growing wealth allowed them to expand their operations and establish the network of corrupt officials and business partners that would enable them to operate with impunity for over a decade more. The evolution of the Willowbrook family's methodology between 1891 and 1894 demonstrated a chilling progression from opportunistic murder to systematic genocide. They had transformed their medical practice into what federal investigators would later describe as a death factory, complete with streamlined processes for victim identification, asset extraction, and body disposal. The family had established criteria for target selection that prioritized efficiency over individual profit, allowing them to increase their kill rate while minimizing exposure to detection. Dr. Willowbrook had developed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that he exploited ruthlessly in his victim selection process. He particularly targeted individuals experiencing major life transitions, recognizing that people in vulnerable emotional states were more likely to trust medical authority and less likely to maintain strong connections with their previous communities. Recent widows, immigrants seeking new opportunities, and individuals fleeing personal scandals became his preferred victims. The family's approach to recent immigrants proved especially profitable and relatively risk-free. These individuals often carried their entire life savings in cash, had minimal documentation of their existence in America, and possessed limited language skills that made them dependent on the family's apparent kindness. Dr. Willowbrook would offer free medical examinations to immigrant families, identifying those with valuable assets while simultaneously assessing their connections to the broader community. The case of the Kowalski family in summer of 1892 exemplified the family's systematic approach to murdering entire groups. Jan Kowalski had arrived from Poland with his wife Anna and their 2 young children, carrying over $2,000 in gold coins sewn into their clothing. They had stopped in Millbrook after their youngest child developed a fever during their journey to relatives in Ohio. Dr. Willowbrook convinced the family that both children were suffering from a dangerous infectious disease that required immediate quarantine and treatment. He established them in a separate building behind his practice, ostensibly to protect the broader community from contagion. Over the following weeks, he systematically poisoned the entire family using compounds that produced symptoms consistent with the disease he had diagnosed. The Kowalski murders netted the family not only the substantial cash the immigrants had been carrying, but also valuable documents that could be used to establish false identities for future operations. Samuel had become expert at forging immigration papers and other official documents, skills that proved invaluable as the family expanded their operations beyond simple murder for profit. Elizabeth had refined her record-keeping system to track multiple ongoing cases simultaneously. Her files contained detailed psychological profiles of potential victims, including their fears, desires, and emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited during the grooming process. She had identified specific conversation topics and behavioral approaches that were most effective for different types of victims, essentially creating a manual for psychological manipulation. Marcus had assumed increasing responsibility for the physical aspects of the operation, including victim restraint when necessary and the actual administration of lethal substances. He had developed a cold, methodical approach to murder that his father found both impressive and disturbing. At 23, Marcus showed no emotional response to the act of killing, treating it as simply another technical skill to be mastered. The family's victim selection had evolved to include what they termed family clusters, groups of related individuals who could be eliminated together to maximize profit while minimizing the number of separate operations required. They particularly targeted families traveling together, recognizing that the disappearance of an entire group was less likely to trigger immediate investigation than multiple individual disappearances. Dr. Willowbrook had also begun targeting patients with specific medical knowledge or skills that could benefit the family's operations. He murdered 2 pharmacists during 1893, stealing their knowledge of drug interactions and poison preparation techniques. A traveling dentist provided valuable information about extracting and selling gold dental work before becoming a victim himself. The systematic nature of the operation extended to their financial management. Constance had established relationships with banks in 3 different states, allowing the family to deposit and transfer large sums of money without triggering suspicion at any single institution. She had also developed a network of corrupt merchants who would purchase stolen goods without asking questions about their origins. The family's growing wealth enabled them to expand their physical infrastructure significantly. They constructed additional buildings on their property, ostensibly for medical purposes but actually designed to facilitate their murder operations. These included a dedicated autopsy room where Samuel could efficiently strip bodies of valuable items, a storage facility for stolen goods, and an expanded cemetery area that could accommodate their increasing kill rate. By 1894, the Willowbrook family was operating what amounted to a murder assembly line. They had standardized their processes to the point where they could identify, groom, kill, and dispose of victims with mechanical efficiency. Their success had made them wealthy beyond their original dreams, but it had also made them increasingly careless about covering their tracks. The very efficiency that had enabled their success would ultimately lead to their downfall. The period from 1894 to 1897 represented the peak of the Willowbrook family's murderous enterprise, a time when their operation reached industrial scale and their network of corruption extended throughout western Pennsylvania. During these 3 years, they would kill an estimated 147 people, averaging more than one murder per week while maintaining their facade as respected members of the Millbrook community. The family had expanded their operation beyond their original medical practice to include what they called satellite stations, strategic partnerships with corrupt individuals in neighboring towns who would identify and direct potential victims to the Willowbrook facility. These included a hotel owner in Pittsburgh who provided information about wealthy guests traveling alone, a railroad station manager who tracked passengers carrying large amounts of luggage or displaying obvious signs of wealth, and several tavern keepers who engaged travelers in conversation to assess their vulnerability and assets. Dr. Willowbrook had established a particularly profitable relationship with Thomas Hartwell, a corrupt insurance agent based in Allegheny who specialized in selling large policies to travelers and recent immigrants. Hartwell would recommend that his clients seek medical examinations from Dr. Willowbrook before their policies could be activated, ostensibly to ensure they were in good health. These examinations inevitably revealed serious conditions that required immediate and expensive treatment at the Willowbrook facility. The insurance scheme had become so lucrative that it now generated more income than their traditional victim robbery methods. Hartwell would sell policies worth $10,000 to $20,000 to carefully selected victims, then split the eventual payouts with the Willowbrook family after the policyholder's convenient death from medical complications. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity and virtually impossible to detect given the limited communication between insurance companies and the primitive investigation methods of the era. Marcus Willowbrook had assumed operational control of the day-to-day murder activities, allowing his father to focus on the broader strategic aspects of their enterprise. Marcus had developed an efficient system for processing victims that could handle multiple simultaneous cases without compromising security or profitability. He had also recruited several local men to assist with the physical labor aspects of the operation, including grave digging and body transportation. These recruited accomplices were carefully selected from the most desperate and morally compromised members of the community. Marcus identified men with gambling debts, drinking problems, or criminal backgrounds who could be blackmailed or bribed into cooperation. None of these men understood the full scope of the operation, believing they were simply helping to dispose of patients who had died from natural causes during medical treatment. The family's wealth had reached extraordinary levels by 1895, requiring increasingly sophisticated methods to manage and conceal their assets. They had purchased properties in 4 different states under various assumed names, established bank accounts throughout the region, and invested heavily in legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for money laundering. Constance had become expert at creating false identities and documentation that allowed the family to operate freely beyond the borders of Millbrook. If this story is giving you chills like it's giving us, you're experiencing the same horror that investigators felt when they uncovered the full scope of this operation decades later. Hit that like button if you can believe a family could systematically murder over 300 people while maintaining such a respectable facade. Share this video with friends who love dark historical mysteries, and don't forget to subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who aren't afraid to confront the darkest chapters of American history. Elizabeth had expanded her record-keeping system to include detailed psychological profiles that the family used to refine their victim manipulation techniques. She had identified specific approaches that were most effective for different demographic groups, creating what amounted to a scientific study of human vulnerability. Her files contained information about optimal waiting periods between initial contact and murder, most effective methods for gaining victim trust, and psychological techniques for encouraging victims to modify their wills and insurance policies. Samuel had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for body disposal that could handle the volume of corpses their operation was generating. He had constructed a series of interconnected burial pits that maximized the use of available space while maintaining the appearance of individual graves. He had also perfected techniques for accelerating decomposition using lime and other chemicals, ensuring that even if bodies were eventually discovered, they would be too degraded to provide useful evidence. The family's success had attracted the attention of other criminal organizations throughout Pennsylvania, leading to the development of what investigators would later describe as a murder syndicate. They had established working relationships with body snatchers who sold corpses to medical schools, grave robbers who stripped valuable items from recent burials, and even other families engaged in similar murder-for-profit schemes. The network had become so extensive that the Willowbrook family was receiving victim referrals from criminal contacts as far away as New York and Chicago. They had developed a reputation within the criminal underworld as efficient and discreet operators who could make inconvenient people disappear without leaving traces that could compromise their criminal partners. By 1897, the family was operating multiple murder facilities simultaneously, including a supposedly abandoned farmhouse 15 miles from Millbrook that served as a processing center for victims who required extended grooming periods. This facility was staffed by some of their most trusted accomplices and equipped with medical equipment that had been stolen from legitimate hospitals and clinics throughout the region. The first serious threat to the Willowbrook operation emerged in late 1897 when Pennsylvania Railroad detective James McCarthy began investigating the disappearance of several wealthy passengers who had last been seen in the Millbrook area. McCarthy had been hired by concerned family members in Chicago and Philadelphia who had lost contact with relatives traveling through western Pennsylvania. His investigation would force the Willowbrook family to confront the reality that their decade-long murder spree had finally attracted the attention of professional investigators. McCarthy's inquiry focused initially on three specific cases: wealthy widow Catherine Morrison, who had disappeared while traveling to visit relatives in Pittsburgh, traveling salesman Robert Sterling, who had vanished after complaining of illness during a business trip, and German immigrant Friedrich Bauer, who had last been seen seeking medical treatment in Millbrook. Each case involved individuals carrying substantial sums of money who had simply vanished without any official record of their deaths or departures from the area. Dr. Willowbrook's initial response to McCarthy's investigation demonstrated the confidence and arrogance that had developed during years of successful operation. When the detective arrived at his practice requesting information about the missing individuals, Dr. Willowbrook readily admitted to treating all three patients. He produced detailed medical records documenting their conditions and deaths, complete with properly witnessed death certificates and burial documentation. However, McCarthy's professional training enabled him to identify inconsistencies in the family's carefully constructed stories. The medical records contained terminology and diagnostic procedures that seemed unusually advanced for a rural practice, and the timing of the death suggested a pattern that stretched statistical probability. Most importantly, McCarthy noted that none of the supposed burial sites contained the substantial personal effects that the victims had been known to possess. The detective's persistent questioning triggered the first crisis the family had faced since beginning their operation. Dr. Willowbrook realized that McCarthy possessed investigative skills and resources far beyond those of local law enforcement officials who had previously accepted the family's explanations without question. The detective's presence in Millbrook represented an existential threat to their continued operation and survival. Marcus Willowbrook advocated for the immediate elimination of Detective McCarthy, arguing that one more suspicious death could be explained away as an unfortunate accident or natural death. However, Dr. Willowbrook recognized that murdering a railroad detective would bring far more scrutiny than their operation could withstand. Instead, He chose a more subtle approach that relied on the family's established network of corrupt officials and their reputation within the community. The family launched a coordinated campaign to discredit McCarthy's investigation by emphasizing their own standing within the community and questioning the detectives' motives. Dr. Willowbrook enlisted the support of prominent townspeople who testified to his character and medical competence. Local officials, some of whom had been quietly bribed over the years, vouched for the legitimacy of the death certificates and burial records that McCarthy was questioning. Constance organized the women of the town to write letters to the Pennsylvania Railroad Company expressing their outrage that such a respected family was being harassed by overzealous investigators. The letters emphasized the family's charitable work and their vital importance to the community's medical care, painting McCarthy as an outsider who was disrupting the peace of their close-knit town. Elizabeth worked behind the scenes to identify and eliminate any physical evidence that could support McCarthy's suspicions. She supervised the careful alteration of medical records to remove inconsistencies the detective had noted, and she coordinated the relocation of valuable items stolen from victims to secure hiding places throughout their network of properties. Samuel focused on modifying the burial sites to better support the family's claims about proper Christian burials. He and his recruited accomplices worked through several nights to rearrange the mass burial pits, adding individual coffins and markers that would create the appearance of legitimate graves if the sites were subjected to closer examination. The family's counter-investigation strategy proved partially successful in deflecting McCarthy's immediate inquiry. Faced with united community opposition and seemingly legitimate documentation, the detective was forced to suspend his active investigation after several weeks. However, he filed detailed reports with his superiors documenting his suspicions and recommending continued monitoring of the Willowbrook family's activities. McCarthy's investigation had revealed a critical vulnerability in the family's operation. Their success had made them visible to law enforcement agencies with resources and expertise far beyond those available to local authorities. The detectives' visits served as a warning that their decade of impunity was ending and that future operations would require dramatically increased security measures. The family responded to this threat by implementing strict new protocols designed to minimize their exposure to detection. They suspended all operations involving victims with strong family connections or high public profiles, focusing instead on individuals whose disappearances were unlikely to trigger professional investigations. They also began developing contingency plans for rapid evacuation of their facilities and assets if future investigations threatened their safety. Despite these precautions, the family's paranoia began to affect their operational efficiency and family dynamics. Trust between family members, which had been absolute during their years of success, began to deteriorate as each member worried about the other's ability to maintain security under pressure. The psychological strain of constantly looking over their shoulders would prove to be as dangerous to their operation as any external investigation. The appointment of Sheriff Daniel Crawford to Allegheny County in January of 1898 marked the beginning of the end for the Willowbrook family's murderous enterprise. Crawford, a former federal marshal with extensive experience investigating organized criminal activity, brought a level of professional competence and persistent curiosity that the family had never encountered from local law enforcement. His arrival in the region would prove to be the catalyst that finally exposed over a decade of systematic murder. Crawford's interest in the Willowbrook family was initially sparked not by Detective McCarthy's earlier investigation, but by routine analysis of county death records that revealed statistical anomalies in the Millbrook area. The mortality rate in and around the Willowbrook medical practice was nearly 3 times higher than comparable rural areas, with an unusually high percentage of deaths occurring among individuals with no local family connections. The new sheriff's background in federal law enforcement had taught him to recognize patterns that local officials might dismiss as coincidence. Crawford noted that the Willowbrook practice attracted an extraordinary number of patients who possessed substantial assets but lacked strong social connections. Even more suspicious was the fact that these wealthy patients consistently died from complications during treatment, while poor local residents with extensive family networks in the area showed remarkably high survival rates. Crawford began his investigation carefully, recognizing that any direct confrontation with the family would likely result in the destruction of evidence and the intimidation of potential witnesses. He started by quietly interviewing residents of neighboring counties who had reported missing relatives, focusing particularly on cases where the missing individuals had last been seen traveling through the Millbrook area. The sheriff's methodical approach quickly uncovered a disturbing pattern of disappearances that stretched back over 10 years. He documented over 40 cases of individuals who had vanished after seeking medical treatment from Dr. Willowbrook, including detailed descriptions of the valuable assets these people had been carrying when they disappeared. The cumulative evidence suggested a level of criminal activity far beyond anything the county had previously encountered. Crawford's investigation received unexpected assistance from Margaret O'Brien, a former patient of Dr. Willowbrook who had survived what she increasingly believed had been an attempt on her life. O'Brien had sought treatment for a minor respiratory ailment in 1896 but had become suspicious when Dr. Willowbrook insisted on extended hospitalization and pressured her to update her will and insurance policies. O'Brien had fled the Willowbrook facility after experiencing symptoms she believed resulted from deliberate poisoning, including severe nausea, heart palpitations, and temporary paralysis that bore no relation to her original respiratory complaint. She had been too frightened to report her suspicions at the time, but Crawford's reputation for integrity and competence convinced her to share her story with law enforcement. Her testimony provided Crawford with the first eyewitness account of the family's methods from someone who had survived their operation. O'Brien described the systematic way the family had gathered information about her financial situation, their insistence on modifying her legal documents, and the suspicious onset of life-threatening symptoms that had no medical explanation related to her original condition. What's your reaction to learning that someone actually escaped this family's murder operation and lived to tell about it? If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat like it's doing to us, share this video with a friend who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our efforts to uncover these buried truths, and subscribe to join our community of fearless truth seekers who refuse to let these stories remain hidden in the shadows of history. Crawford used O'Brien's testimony as the foundation for a broader investigation that included interviews with current and former employees of the Willowbrook practice. The sheriff discovered that several local men had been hired over the years to perform manual labor around the facility, including extensive digging projects that the family had claimed were for medical waste disposal and cemetery maintenance. These workers provided disturbing accounts of the volume of burial activity at the Willowbrook facility, describing almost constant digging and the transportation of unusually heavy containers to burial sites under cover of darkness. Several workers reported that they had been specifically instructed never to speak about their activities and had been paid substantially more than prevailing wages for manual labor, suggesting the family was buying their silence. Crawford's investigation also revealed financial irregularities that supported suspicions of large-scale theft and fraud. Bank records showed that the Willowbrook family had deposited amounts of cash far exceeding what any legitimate medical practice could generate, and the timing of these deposits often corresponded with the disappearances of wealthy travelers in the area. The sheriff discovered that Dr. Willowbrook had established financial relationships with institutions throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states, spreading large cash deposits across multiple banks to avoid triggering suspicion at any single location. The family's wealth had grown to extraordinary levels that could not be explained by legitimate medical income, even accounting for their reputation and apparent success. As Crawford's investigation progressed, he began to notice changes in the family's behavior that suggested they were aware of his interest in their activities. The number of patients seeking treatment at the Willowbrook facility dropped dramatically, and several community members reported that the family seemed increasingly nervous and paranoid in their public interactions. Dr. Willowbrook had begun making inquiries about property values in other states and had been seen examining railroad schedules and steamship departure times. These activities suggested that the family was preparing for the possibility of rapid departure from Millbrook, a development that convinced Crawford he needed to accelerate his investigation before critical evidence could be destroyed or the perpetrators could escape justice. The sheriff realized that he was racing against time to gather sufficient evidence for arrests before the Willowbrook family either eliminated remaining witnesses or fled the jurisdiction entirely. The investigation had reached a critical phase where any delay could result in the permanent escape of the most prolific family of murderers in American history. Sheriff Crawford's breakthrough came in September of 1898 when he discovered a cache of forged documents hidden in the basement of a corrupt attorney's office in Pittsburgh. The attorney, Harrison Blackwood, had been arrested on unrelated fraud charges, and during the search of his premises, investigators uncovered hundreds of falsified insurance policies, property deeds, and death certificates that bore the signatures of Dr. Ezekiel Willowbrook and his family members as witnesses. The document discovery revealed the scope of the Willowbrook operation in devastating detail. Blackwood had been facilitating insurance fraud on behalf of the family for over 6 years, processing false claims worth more than $200,000. The paperwork documented systematic theft from victims, including detailed inventories of stolen property, forged wills transferring assets to fictitious beneficiaries controlled by the family, and correspondence discussing optimal methods for eliminating witnesses to their crimes. Blackwood's arrest created panic within the Willowbrook family's network of corrupt accomplices throughout western Pennsylvania. Several co-conspirators attempted to flee the region, while others approached Sheriff Crawford seeking immunity in exchange for testimony against the family. The collapse of their criminal network provided Crawford with multiple witnesses and documentary evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of over 11 years of systematic murder. Margaret O'Brien's testimony became even more crucial as Crawford built his case. She provided detailed descriptions of the family's methods for gathering intelligence about potential victims, including their techniques for encouraging patients to discuss their financial situations and family connections. Her account of the systematic poisoning attempt gave Crawford insight into the medical methods the family used to kill their victims while maintaining plausible deniability. O'Brien also revealed that she had overheard conversations between family members discussing other patients who had been targeted for elimination. She remembered specific names and dates that Crawford was able to match with missing person reports and suspicious death certificates, providing direct evidence linking the family to multiple murders. The sheriff's investigation uncovered physical evidence that corroborated witness testimony about the family's activities. A search of the Willowbrook property revealed hidden compartments containing stolen jewelry, gold dental work, and personal effects belonging to dozens of missing individuals. The discovery of these items provided irrefutable proof that the family had been systematically robbing and murdering their patients. Crawford also found extensive records maintained by Elizabeth Willowbrook that documented the family's victim selection criteria and operational methods. Her meticulous files contained psychological profiles of murdered patients, detailed financial assessments of their assets, and strategic plans for extracting maximum profit from each killing. The records revealed the cold, calculated nature of the family's approach to mass murder. The evidence gathered from Elizabeth's files enabled Crawford to reconstruct the family's evolution from opportunistic killers to systematic murderers operating on an industrial scale. Her documentation showed how they had refined their methods over time, developing increasingly sophisticated approaches to victim manipulation, asset extraction, and evidence destruction. Samuel Willowbrook's chemistry laboratory provided additional evidence of the family's murder methods. Crawford discovered extensive supplies of poisons and toxic compounds along with detailed notes documenting their effects on human physiology. Samuel had been conducting what amounted to scientific research into optimal methods for inducing death while avoiding detection during post-mortem examination. The laboratory also contained equipment for forging official documents and altering existing records. Samuel had developed expertise in reproducing government seals, official letterheads, and the signatures of legitimate authorities throughout Pennsylvania. This capability had enabled the family to create false documentation supporting their cover stories about patient deaths and asset transfers. Crawford's investigation revealed that the family had been planning their escape from Millbrook for several months before his appointment as sheriff. They had established safe houses in 3 different states and had begun transferring their assets to locations beyond the reach of Pennsylvania law enforcement. The family's preparation for flight suggested they had always recognized that their operation would eventually be discovered. Marcus Willowbrook had been assigned responsibility for eliminating potential witnesses who could testify against the family. Crawford discovered evidence that Marcus had murdered at least 6 individuals who had expressed suspicions about the family's activities, including a former employee who had threatened to report his knowledge of the burial operations to authorities. The witness elimination campaign had included the murder of Detective James McCarthy, whose body was discovered in a remote area 20 miles from Millbrook. McCarthy had been killed with the same poison compounds found in Samuel's laboratory, confirming that the family had graduated from defensive measures to actively hunting down threats to their operation. Dr. Willowbrook's response to the mounting investigation demonstrated the arrogance and miscalculation that had characterized the family's approach throughout their criminal career. Rather than attempting to flee immediately, he chose to remain in Millbrook and continue his medical practice while seeking to discredit Crawford's investigation through political pressure and community influence. The doctor's decision to stay and fight rather than flee would prove to be the fatal error that ensured the family's capture and prosecution. His confidence in his ability to manipulate public opinion and corrupt official processes had been justified for over a decade, but Crawford's professional competence and federal connections represented a level of law enforcement capability that the family had never previously encountered. By October of 1898, Crawford had assembled sufficient evidence to seek federal arrest warrants for the entire Willowbrook family. The case had grown beyond the jurisdiction of local courts and would require federal prosecution due to the interstate nature of the family's criminal activities and the involvement of corrupted state officials in facilitating their operations. The confrontation between Sheriff Crawford and the Willowbrook family reached its climax on the morning of November 15, 1898, when federal marshals arrived in Millbrook with arrest warrants charging the entire family with multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Dr. Willowbrook's decision to remain in the community and attempt to weather the investigation through political influence had given Crawford the time needed to build an overwhelming case that would soon expose the full horror of their 11-year murder spree. The family's first indication that their world was collapsing came when federal agents simultaneously raided their medical practice, residence, and the remote burial sites behind their property. The coordinated operation had been planned with military precision to prevent the destruction of evidence and ensure that none of the family members could escape or communicate warnings to their remaining accomplices throughout the region. Dr. Willowbrook's initial response to the raid demonstrated the same arrogance that had characterized his approach throughout the investigation. He demanded to see the arrest warrants and insisted that the federal agents were exceeding their authority by interfering with his legitimate medical practice. His protests became increasingly desperate as agents began uncovering the physical evidence that Crawford had been carefully cataloging for months. The discovery of stolen personal effects belonging to dozens of missing individuals sent shock waves through the assembled crowd of townspeople who had gathered to witness the arrests. Items that family members of missing persons had described in heartbreaking detail were found carefully stored in hidden compartments throughout the Willowbrook property, providing irrefutable proof of the family's guilt to witnesses who had previously defended their character. Constance Willowbrook attempted to maintain her composed facade even as federal agents discovered her detailed financial records documenting years of theft and fraud. Her meticulous bookkeeping, which had been crucial to the family's operational success, now provided prosecutors with comprehensive documentation of their criminal enterprise. Every stolen dollar, every forged insurance claim, and every fraudulent property transfer had been carefully recorded in her ledgers. Elizabeth's psychological profiles and victim selection criteria shocked even experienced federal investigators who had seen extensive criminal activity throughout their careers. Her files revealed the cold, scientific approach the family had taken to identifying and manipulating vulnerable individuals, treating human lives as nothing more than business opportunities to be evaluated and exploited for maximum profit. Marcus Willowbrook's response to arrest revealed the violent nature that had always lurked beneath his respectable exterior. He attempted to attack the arresting officers and had to be physically restrained after threatening to kill anyone who testified against his family. His behavior provided a glimpse of the ruthless personality that had enabled him to murder dozens of people without apparent emotional response. Samuel's chemistry laboratory yielded evidence that horrified even medical professionals among the federal investigation team. His detailed notes on poison effects, optimal dosages for inducing specific symptoms, and methods for accelerating decomposition revealed a level of scientific knowledge devoted entirely to facilitating murder and concealing evidence of criminal activity. The excavation of the burial sites behind the Willowbrook property began immediately following the arrests and continued for weeks as investigators attempted to account for all of the family's victims. The discovery of mass burial pits containing hundreds of bodies, many bearing evidence of violent death, finally revealed the true scope of what the family had accomplished during their years of operation. Local residents who had defended the family for over a decade were forced to confront the reality that they had been living alongside the most prolific serial killers in American history. The community's shock and shame at their failure to recognize the signs of systematic murder occurring in their midst would haunt Millbrook for generations. The family's network of accomplices began surrendering to authorities throughout western Pennsylvania as news of the arrests spread. Corrupt officials, criminal associates, and hired laborers who had facilitated the operation sought legal immunity in exchange for testimony that would help prosecutors understand the full extent of the conspiracy. Federal investigators worked around the clock to process the overwhelming amount of evidence seized during the raids. Bank records, forged documents, stolen property, and witness testimony painted a picture of criminal activity that exceeded anything previously documented in American law enforcement history. The case would require months of preparation before prosecutors would be ready for trial. Dr. Willowbrook's final attempt to escape justice came during transport to the federal courthouse in Pittsburgh, when he tried to convince his guards that he possessed information about other criminal organizations that would be valuable to federal authorities. His desperate offer to trade information for reduced charges demonstrated his complete inability to comprehend the magnitude of his crimes or accept responsibility for over 300 murders. The family's capture marked the end of an era of criminal impunity that had been enabled by limited communication between law enforcement agencies, primitive investigation techniques, and widespread corruption among local officials. Their case would become a catalyst for reforms in medical practice oversight, insurance fraud prevention, and interstate law enforcement cooperation. The revelation that a respected family had systematically murdered over 300 people while maintaining the facade of community leadership forced American society to confront uncomfortable questions about the reliability of social institutions and the vulnerability of isolated individuals to exploitation by those in positions of trust and authority. News of the arrests and the discovery of mass burial sites reached newspapers throughout the United States, creating a sensation that would influence public policy and law enforcement practices for decades. The Willowbrook case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of maintaining vigilant oversight of those entrusted with public welfare. The trial of the Willowbrook family began on March 8, 1899, in the federal courthouse in Pittsburgh, drawing unprecedented public attention and establishing legal precedents that would influence American jurisprudence for decades. Federal prosecutors had assembled what they described as the most comprehensive murder case in the nation's history, with evidence documenting 313 confirmed victims and systematic criminal activity spanning 11 years. The prosecution's opening statement lasted 4 hours and provided the first public accounting of the full scope of the family's crimes. Prosecutor Harrison Wade methodically described how Dr. Ezekiel Willowbrook had transformed a legitimate medical practice into what he termed a murder factory, using his position of trust and authority to systematically identify, rob, and kill vulnerable individuals seeking medical care. Margaret O'Brien's testimony as the prosecution's star witness provided the courtroom with a chilling first-hand account of the family's methods. Her detailed description of how the family had gathered intelligence about her financial situation, pressured her to modify her legal documents, and then attempted to poison her while maintaining the facade of medical treatment shocked even experienced court reporters who had covered numerous criminal trials. O'Brien's credibility was enhanced by her ability to provide specific details about the family's operation that could be corroborated by physical evidence and other witness testimony. Her account of overhearing conversations between family members discussing the elimination of other patients provided prosecutors with direct evidence of premeditation and conspiracy that was crucial to securing murder convictions. The prosecution presented evidence documenting the family's systematic approach to victim selection, including Elizabeth's detailed files containing psychological profiles and financial assessments of potential targets. These records demonstrated that the murders were not crimes of passion or opportunity, but carefully planned operations designed to maximize profit while minimizing the risk of detection. Financial evidence presented during the trial revealed the extraordinary wealth the family had accumulated through their criminal activities. Bank records showed cash deposits totaling over $400,000 during their 11 years of operation, an amount that represented hundreds of times the income that any legitimate rural medical practice could generate during that period. The testimony of surviving accomplices provided prosecutors with insider knowledge of the family's operational methods and decision-making processes. Former employees described the systematic way the family had approached murder, including their techniques for identifying vulnerable victims, their methods for disposing of bodies, and their strategies for avoiding law enforcement detection. Federal investigators testified about the discovery of mass burial sites containing the remains of hundreds of victims, many bearing evidence of violent death that contradicted the natural death certificates Dr. Willowbrook had filed with county authorities. The forensic evidence provided irrefutable proof that the family had been systematically murdering patients while falsifying official records to conceal their crimes. The defense strategy focused on attempting to shift responsibility away from individual family members and onto Dr. Willowbrook as the mastermind of the operation. Defense attorneys argued that Constance, Elizabeth, Marcus, and Samuel had been manipulated and coerced by the family patriarch, portraying them as victims of his psychological control rather than willing participants in mass murder. However, the prosecution's evidence demonstrated that each family member had played specific and crucial roles in the operation, with detailed documentation showing their individual contributions to victim identification, murder, asset theft, and evidence concealment. The systematic nature of their activities made it impossible to characterize any family member as an unwilling participant. What do you think about a family that could systematically murder over 300 people while maintaining such a convincing facade of respectability? If this trial testimony is as shocking to you as it was to the people packed into that Pittsburgh courtroom in 1899, share this video with someone who needs to hear this incredible true story. Hit that like button if you can believe the level of evidence prosecutors assembled, and subscribe to our channel for more buried historical mysteries that reveal the darkest chapters of American history. Dr. Willowbrook's testimony on his own behalf provided the most dramatic moments of the trial, as he attempted to justify his actions by claiming that his victims had been suffering from terminal illnesses and that he had simply provided them with peaceful deaths while ensuring their assets were put to productive use. His complete lack of remorse and his apparent belief that he had performed a public service shocked courtroom observers and sealed his fate with the jury. The prosecution's rebuttal demolished Dr. Willowbrook's claims by presenting medical evidence showing that most of his supposed terminal patients had been suffering from minor, easily treatable conditions. Expert medical testimony demonstrated that the family's victims had been systematically poisoned using compounds that produce symptoms consistent with the diseases Dr. Willowbrook had claimed to be treating. Constance Willowbrook's testimony revealed the financial sophistication of the operation and her crucial role in managing the stolen assets and fraudulent insurance claims. Her detailed knowledge of the family's criminal activities made it clear that she had been a full partner in the enterprise rather than a manipulated victim of her husband's influence. The testimony phase of the trial lasted 6 weeks and included over 200 witnesses, making it one of the most extensively documented criminal proceedings in American legal history. The comprehensive nature of the evidence presented would establish new standards for federal prosecution of complex criminal conspiracies. Elizabeth's testimony provided insight into the psychological aspects of the family's operation, including their techniques for manipulating victims and their methods for selecting individuals who would be unlikely to trigger immediate investigation if they disappeared. Her clinical approach to discussing mass murder demonstrated the complete moral corruption that had enabled the family's crimes. Marcus and Samuel's testimony revealed the operational details of the murder and disposal processes, including their specialized knowledge of poisons, body disposal techniques, and evidence destruction methods. Their matter-of-fact descriptions of systematic killing provided the jury with a clear understanding of the industrial scale on which the family had operated. The trial's conclusion would mark not only the end of the Willowbrook family's reign of terror, but also the beginning of significant reforms in medical practice oversight, insurance fraud prevention, and interstate law enforcement cooperation that would help prevent similar crimes in the future. The jury's deliberation in the Willowbrook case lasted only 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against every family member, bringing to a close what federal prosecutors described as the most extensive murder trial in American history. The speed of the verdict reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence presented and the jury's horror at the systematic nature of the crimes that had been perpetuated over 11 years in rural Pennsylvania. Dr. Ezekiel Willowbrook received the death sentence for his role as the mastermind of the operation, making him the first physician in American history to be executed for systematically murdering his patients. The judge's sentencing statement condemned Willowbrook for violating the most sacred trust in society, that between healer and patient, and for using his medical knowledge to perfect methods of undetectable murder. Constance Willowbrook was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, a sentence that reflected her crucial role in managing the financial aspects of the operation and her participation in the systematic deception of victims and authorities. Her detailed record-keeping had provided prosecutors with the evidence necessary to document the full scope of the family's crimes, ironically ensuring her own conviction. Marcus Willowbrook received the death sentence for his role in carrying out the actual murders and for eliminating witnesses who threatened the family's operation. His execution was specifically recommended by the jury due to evidence that he had personally killed Detective James McCarthy and at least 12 other individuals who had expressed suspicions about the family's activities. Elizabeth and Samuel Willowbrook, due to their youth when the crimes began, received sentences of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. However, the judge noted that their systematic participation in mass murder demonstrated a level of moral corruption that made their eventual rehabilitation highly unlikely. The sentencing phase revealed additional details about the scope of the family's criminal network that had not been fully explored during the trial. Federal investigators had identified over 40 accomplices throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states who had facilitated the family's operations through corruption, witness intimidation, and the disposal of stolen goods. The collapse of the Willowbrook network led to a wave of secondary prosecutions that continued for over 2 years following the family's conviction. Corrupt officials, insurance agents, attorneys, and business partners who had enabled the family's crimes faced federal charges that resulted in the largest law enforcement cleanup in Pennsylvania history. The investigation also revealed connections between the Willowbrook family and other criminal organizations operating throughout the region, suggesting that their murder operation had been part of a broader network of systematic criminality that had infected multiple institutions and communities. Federal authorities estimated that the total number of victims of this criminal network exceeded 500 individuals. The community of Millbrook struggled to cope with the revelation that they had unknowingly harbored the most prolific family of murderers in American history. Many residents who had defended the family and vouched for their character experienced psychological trauma and guilt that would affect the community for generations. Several families left the area permanently, unable to reconcile their memories of the respected Willowbrook family with the reality of their crimes. The Willowbrook property was seized by federal authorities and eventually demolished after local residents expressed concerns about preserving any structure associated with such extensive criminal activity. The burial sites were excavated completely, with victims' remains relocated to a memorial cemetery established specifically to honor those who had died at the hands of the family. Margaret O'Brien's survival and testimony had been crucial to securing convictions, but her experience had left her permanently traumatized by her encounter with the family's systematic approach to murder. She relocated to California following the trial and spent the remainder of her life advocating for improved oversight of medical practitioners and protections for vulnerable patients. The case prompted significant reforms in medical practice regulation, including requirements for standardized record-keeping, periodic review of mortality rates, and background investigations for physicians seeking to establish practices in new communities. These reforms were specifically designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse of medical authority that had enabled the Willowbrook crimes. Insurance industry practices were also fundamentally changed as a result of the case, with new requirements for investigation of claims involving recently issued policies and coordination between insurance companies to identify patterns of suspicious claims. The industry established the first systematic fraud prevention programs in response to the massive losses suffered due to the Willowbrook conspiracy. Federal law enforcement agencies used the case to justify expanded jurisdiction over interstate criminal activities and improved coordination between local and federal investigators. The Willowbrook investigation demonstrated the limitations of purely local law enforcement when confronting sophisticated criminal organizations with resources and connections spanning multiple states. The psychological impact of the case extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families, influencing public perceptions of medical authority and institutional trustworthiness throughout American society. The revelation that respected community leaders could systematically murder hundreds of people while maintaining facade of respectability forced a national re-evaluation of blind trust in authority figures. Academic institutions began incorporating case studies of the Willowbrook crimes into medical and legal education programs, using the family's systematic approach to murder as an example of how professional knowledge and social position could be corrupted for criminal purposes. The case became a cautionary tale taught to generations of students. The broader implications of the Willowbrook case influenced American criminal justice policy for decades, establishing precedents for federal prosecution of complex conspiracies and demonstrating the importance of interstate law enforcement cooperation in confronting sophisticated criminal organizations. The case marked a turning point in American law enforcement capabilities and federal jurisdiction over criminal activities that crossed state boundaries. The execution of Dr. Ezekiel Willowbrook on September 14, 1900, marked the final chapter in one of the most horrific criminal cases in American history, but the legacy of the family's crimes would continue to influence American society, law enforcement, and medical practice for generations to come. As the trapdoor fell beneath the gallows in the federal prison yard, witnesses reported that Dr. Willowbrook showed no remorse for the 313 lives he had systematically destroyed during his 11-year reign of terror in rural Pennsylvania. Marcus Willowbrook was executed 6 months later, on March 20, 1901, after exhausting all appeals and attempts to commute his death sentence. Unlike his father, Marcus displayed visible terror during his final moments, suggesting that his participation in mass murder had been motivated more by family loyalty and financial greed than by the cold psychological detachment that had characterized Dr. Willowbrook's approach to systematic killing. Constance Willowbrook died in federal prison in 1918, having served 19 years of her life sentence. Prison records indicated that she had never expressed remorse for her role in the murders and had spent her incarceration attempting to write a memoir that portrayed the family as victims of a corrupt legal system. Her manuscript was confiscated by prison authorities and subsequently destroyed to prevent its publication. Elizabeth Willowbrook was released from federal prison in 1929 after serving 30 years of her sentence, making her the only family member to survive incarceration and return to society. She relocated to Oregon under an assumed name and worked as a domestic servant until her death in 1954, never speaking publicly about her family's crimes or attempting to contact any surviving relatives of their victims. Samuel Willowbrook died in federal prison in 1933, having served 34 years of his sentence. Prison officials reported that he had spent his incarceration continuing his chemistry studies and had attempted to develop new compounds that could be used for various industrial applications. His scientific interests, which had been perverted to facilitate murder, remained his primary focus until his death. The memorial cemetery established to honor the Willowbrook victims became a site of pilgrimage for family members who had spent decades searching for missing relatives. The cemetery contained 313 marked graves, each bearing the name of a confirmed victim when known, or simply marked as unknown when the family's systematic destruction of records made identification impossible. Federal authorities continued to investigate potential Willowbrook victims for over a decade following the family's conviction, as reports of missing individuals from throughout the region were compared against the timeline of the family's operation. Additional burial sites were discovered as far as 50 miles from Millbrook, suggesting that the family's criminal activities had been even more extensive than initially documented. The Willowbrook case became a foundational study in the emerging field of criminal psychology, with researchers attempting to understand how an entire family could participate in systematic murder while maintaining the psychological compartmentalization necessary to function in normal society. The case influenced early theories about the nature of psychopathy and the development of criminal behavior within family systems. Medical schools throughout the United States incorporated case studies of the Willowbrook crimes into their curricula, using the family's systematic abuse of medical authority as an example of the ethical responsibilities that accompanied professional knowledge and social trust. The case became a cautionary tale about the potential for corruption when professional expertise was combined with unchecked authority. The insurance industry's response to the massive fraud perpetrated by the Willowbrook family led to the establishment of the first systematic fraud investigation departments and interstate information sharing networks. These developments significantly reduced the ability of future criminals to manipulate insurance systems across multiple states, though similar schemes would continue to emerge as criminals adapted to new protective measures. Law enforcement agencies used the Willowbrook case to justify expanded federal jurisdiction over interstate criminal activities and to establish new standards for cooperation between local and federal investigators. The case demonstrated that sophisticated criminal organizations required equally sophisticated law enforcement responses that could operate across jurisdictional boundaries. The town of Millbrook never fully recovered from the revelation that it had unknowingly harbored such extensive criminal activity for over a decade. The community's population declined by nearly half in the years following the trial, as residents relocated to escape the stigma associated with their failure to recognize the systematic murder occurring in their midst. What do you think about this chilling tale of systematic murder hidden behind a facade of medical respectability? How could an entire community fail to recognize that over 300 people were being systematically murdered by their most trusted physician? Share your thoughts in the comments below about this incredible true story that was buried in official records for decades. If you enjoyed this investigation into one of America's most horrific family crimes, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our explorations of the darkest chapters in American history. Thanks for joining our community of truth seekers who aren't afraid to confront these buried secrets of the past. The broader impact of the Willowbrook case on American society included fundamental changes in how communities evaluated and monitored authority figures, particularly those in positions involving public trust and safety. The case demonstrated that respected social position and professional credentials could not be assumed to guarantee moral character or ethical behavior. Modern criminal investigators continue to study the Willowbrook case as an example of how systematic criminal activity can operate undetected within seemingly respectable institutions. The family's methods for victim selection, evidence destruction, and community manipulation provide insights that remain relevant to contemporary law enforcement efforts to identify and investigate organized criminal activities. The legacy of the Willowbrook family's crimes serves as a permanent reminder that evil can flourish behind facades of respectability and that vigilant oversight of those entrusted with public welfare remains essential to preventing similar tragedies. Their story stands as one of the most chilling examples of systematic murder in American history, a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of isolated individuals to exploitation by those who abuse positions of trust and authority for the most heinous criminal purposes.